So the United States and Europe are starting to take drastically different approaches with how to bring about an end to the war in Ukraine. In fact, just this week, U.S. National Security Advisor Michael Waltz talked about how it's not necessarily in the United States' best interest for Russian forces to be entirely pushed out of Ukrainian territory. At the same time, like happening right now, is something called the Coalition of the Willing in London, where a group of military chiefs and defense ministers from across Europe are getting together talking about the possibility of putting boots on the ground and aircraft overhead in Ukrainian skies. Seriously, that's what we have direct quotes that is in the conversation right now. But to get started, let's take a look at the U.S. perspective here coming from Michael Waltz.
Martha, we have to ask ourselves, is it in our national interest? Is it realistic? We've talked to the Europeans about this and the Ukrainians. Are we going to drive every Russian off of every inch of Ukrainian soil, including Crimea? And what the strategy of the Biden administration was as long as it takes, as much as it takes, no matter what the timeline is, which is essentially endless warfare, in an environment that we're literally losing hundreds of thousands of people in a matter of months and could escalate into World War III. So
Mr. Waltz.
we can talk about what's right and wrong, and we also have to talk about the reality of the situation on the ground.
All right, so I got to think there's a little bit of negotiation strategy going on here because this is an extreme view. The idea that Ukraine is going to be able to push all Russian troops out of occupied territory, including Crimea, it's not really on the table. In fact, you don't even see Ukrainian leaders arguing for that anymore. I think they understand as well that that is not a realistic objective unless there's, essentially NATO troops fighting alongside Ukraine to push the Russians back. It's just not realistic right now. And we haven't heard that from Ukraine in quite a while. But when I say it's an extreme view, I understand why Ukraine would want that. I would too if I were in their shoes. But there's got to be a middle ground between pushing all Russian forces out of all occupied territory to include Crimea and just ceding all of that territory to Russia, to include areas in the east and the south that Russia has claimed ownership of, but they don't actually possess. So hopefully this is some sort of negotiating tactic coming from the United States. But you can see this does kind of follow a trend of we're just saying, listen, there's only so much we can do when it comes to this conflict, whereas Europe more and more are talking the talk, at least, of kind of taking a stand and saying, we're not going to let this slide. We're actually going to get more involved and bring about an end to this conflict on our terms, to even talk about boots on the ground and aircraft overhead. Here's a recent statement from UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer.
I've indicated a willingness for the United Kingdom to play a leading role in this, and indicated that if it's necessary, that will be troops on the ground and planes in the sky.
A lot of this kind of came up in recent weeks because Ukraine agreed to this 30-day ceasefire put forward by the United States. And I should mention again, there were no terms to that. It was just, hey, stop killing each other for 30 days. And Ukraine said, got it. We're on board. So kind of moved away any arguments that Zelensky in Ukraine is the impediment to peace here. Russia essentially sat on it. Putin kind of brushed it aside and said, yes, we want peace, just not like this, peace on our terms, which tends to be more of their maximalist war aims. But following that, we really saw kind of the coming out, if you will, of the UK and this coalition of the willing talking about what they're going to do to pressure Putin to get him to the table.
Sooner or later, Putin will have to come to the table. So this is the moment. Let the guns fall silent. Let the barbaric attacks on Ukraine once and for all stop, and agree to a ceasefire now.
And one noticeable difference here when looking at Starmer's comments versus what we've heard in the past from Biden and now from Trump is that he applies this directly to the British people, saying, hey, this isn't something happening over there. This directly affects us, and here's how. Let's give it a listen.
And let's be clear why this is so important. Russia's appetite for conflict and chaos undermines our security back here at home in the United Kingdom. It drives up the cost of living. It drives up energy costs. So this matters deeply to the United Kingdom. That is why now is the time to engage in discussion on a mechanism to manage and monitor a full ceasefire and agree to serious negotiations towards not just a pause, but a lasting peace, backed by strong security arrangements through our coalition of the willing.
So, of course, a big question here is what do peacekeeping troops actually look like on the ground in Ukraine? Like, do they have to engage with Russian forces? And there was a good question here asking just that by one of these reporters. And my takeaway is don't really have that sorted out quite yet, but let's give it a listen.
Sam Coates, Sky News. Prime Minister, I'm struggling to work out what the coalition of the willing actually does on the ground. As far as I understand it, UK troops couldn't fire at Russian troops. If Russian troops opened fire, we couldn't retaliate, and nor could anybody else, because of what that would provoke. So is it just some kind of slightly more tepid training mission in reality? What's the basis on international law? What's the remit? And why couldn't the UN be involved?
Well, the operational meeting is where the discussions are taking place as to what the capabilities will be. I've indicated a willingness for the United Kingdom to play a leading role in this, and indicated that if it's necessary, that will be troops on the ground and planes in the sky. There are different capabilities from different countries, but those are the operational discussions that are going on in relation to what this coalition of the willing will be able to provide.
Keir Starmer was also pushed on the whole, what if Russia doesn't actually want to negotiate? What are you going to do to force them to the negotiating table? And that's something we've talked about quite a bit on this channel, is we've seen a lot of sticks applied to Ukraine, some carrots applied to Russia. But what if Russia keeps doing the thing that they're doing right now? What then? Keir Starmer was asked essentially that question.
Hi, Prime Minister, there's a possible, perhaps even likely scenario where Vladimir Putin doesn't come to his senses, where he continues putting unreasonable demands on any ceasefire, on any negotiated settlement, perhaps doesn't even come to the table at all. And in that scenario, we can't be certain that Donald Trump is going to side with us and not with him. What's plan B?
Well, firstly, we need to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position for whatever comes next, which has been my consistent position, whether that's around the table, which is what I hope it will be in negotiations, or if that doesn't come to pass.
Look, to me, that answer actually sounded a lot like what we heard from President Biden and everyone in his administration, where it's not really a clear answer, right? There's the overt, very aggressive answer of we're going to strike Russia, I think is probably what some reporters are thinking they might hear at some point in an exchange like this. But really all we hear is, well, we're going to make Ukraine stronger, make sure they are in the best possible negotiating position, which, listen, that's kind of what National Security Advisor Mike Waltz was pushing back against at the beginning of this video, that idea that we're getting there. It's going to take more, but we're going to get there. And eventually, once we get to that point, undefined point, when Ukraine is in a stronger position, then we will see some change in Russian attitudes. But either way, this coalition of the willing, this will be an interesting thing to watch that plays out just this week. We'll do our best to keep you updated. But that's all I've got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.